All right, Doug, let's talk about managing.
Nobody knows what I'm going to say, so this is going to be exciting. I'm looking for the ball.
I'm on the edge of my seat. Okay. For some reason, it didn't want to go. Did it come up?
Yep. We got it?
Yeah.
Can you see it?
I got you.
We're recording.
Yep.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Great to be here on a Monday and to talk about upcoming season. It's a good time to be talking about seasonal employees. I know a lot of you are looking at this already. I know a lot of our friends out there in mosquito abatement, you've already been going through your hiring process and getting your crews lined up for the summer. We have a lot of people that we bring on for different capacities, whether it's in recreation programs, parks, parks maintenance, seasonal programs like mosquito abatement. There's a lot of different areas out there where we use seasonal employees, mostly, in the summertime, but there can be seasonal employees at any time of year, depending on what your operations are and what your needs are. And there are some specific issues that are important to keep in mind when we're talking about seasonal employees. A lot of the risks that we face, whether they be safety or liability, can be very similar with seasonal employees versus our regular employees. And there's some things that can be very specific to the seasonal or temporary employee also that can change the risk that we deal with. Obviously, safety is a big concern. Someone who's just working a seasonal job, there's going to be less experience and expertise there. So safety becomes an issue. Training also, when you're looking at these seasonal positions, you spend a lot more of the time that you're paying that employee in training them versus, actually out there doing their job. We hire a regular employee, we do a lot of training with them, and then we get to have them, work with us for years and years and years, taking advantage of that initial training. But a seasonal employee may only be working for us for 2, 3, 4 months, and we still have to do that similar level of training with that seasonal employee as we would with a regular employee. So there's issues there on training. Supervision also has some challenges, some ways that our seasonal hires affect our ability to supervise those employees appropriately. And of course, a lot of our seasonal hires are minors. They're maybe under the age of 18, doing different things, whether they're working at the pool or at the golf course, or if they're working, in the parks or wherever they are. We have a lot of minors that we give seasonal jobs to, and there's specific child labor laws that we have to deal with. In fact, a lot of the questions that come up with regards to seasonal and temporary employment is, with the child labor laws. What can we do? What can't we do with these employees? So let's kind of talk about each of these little points in varying degrees of detail here. First of all, let's look at the risk that we have associated with safety and the short-time employee. Went through and I ran this report on work comp claims, work comp injuries that we have had over the last 4 years, and I break it down by the length of employment, how long employees have been working for us. And so we can see that first bar is not the highest bar, but it also represents less than a year, whereas the subsequent bars on that bar chart represent 4, 5, 10 years. So we can see when you look at it that way that, it's actually a much higher rate of injury that's occurring with employees in those first 12 months, in those first few months even of employment versus long-term employees. In fact, the way that works out is for the trust pool, about 38 of these employees get injured per year in that first year of employment before they even get to an anniversary date. If we then go to the next 4 years, we're looking at 13. So really those employees in that first year of employment are about 3 times as likely to get injured and have a work comp claim as employees from 1 to 9 years. When we get up to over 10 years, that 10 to 14 year category, then that 1 year employee is about 6 times more likely to have an injury. And when you look at the 15 to 24 category, that 10 year category, your brand new employee is actually 12 times more likely to have an injury than an employee who's been with you 15 to 25 years. So we see just right there, there's an increased risk that's very significant. How do we keep these employees safe when they're out there? Why do we have such a higher rate of injury for these employees in their first year? And there's a lot of factors going into this. It could be the type of work that we're using them for, that it's more of the kind of work that they might have an injury with. It could be that just the experience factor isn't there, and so they're more likely to make mistakes. It could also be, that they don't care as much. You've got a long-time employee who's been with you for a decade or 2 decades. That employee is much more likely to be concerned with and care about operations and making sure that operations are safe and that we're doing things right than the brand new employee is, or even worse, the employee who knows they're only going to be here for a short time. That employee who's just here for the summer, they're not really invested in your success. They're here to get a paycheck for a few months during the summer vacation, in between school years or whatever. And so there's a difference in attitude that we really have to look out for. Lots of times, especially when these employees are younger, we also have to deal with, their attitudes, their judgment is often very different, because of their age and maturity levels. When we look at bringing on seasonal employees, we have different options of how to fill our needs. You may look to volunteers, and volunteers is something we've talked about in the past. In fact, we've done whole presentations on, hiring or bringing on volunteers and how to manage volunteers. It's very similar to how you manage an employee. And often those volunteers are just short time as well. So we run into some of these same issues with the propensity to get injured, because it is short time on the job, maybe lack of training and some of these other things. You may go to just adults to fill seasonal positions, or you may have these youth, which have different challenges in and of themselves. Another option is to go to temp agencies to fill your seasonal needs, and that's something we've seen more and more of our members doing with some success. And so we'll kind of touch on that as well as we go through the presentation here this morning. So, volunteers and seasonal employees have, a specific risk exposure. In some cases, it's going to be the same as a regular employee, and then other cases, it may be a greater risk as your regular employees. When we talk about volunteers specifically, we look at, liability exposure. So volunteers and seasonal employees, we bring these people on. If they are in an official capacity, either as a volunteer or a seasonal employee, they still represent us. And so we are exposed to things that they may do in damaging other people's property or in how they interact with other people in a way that could create potential liabilities. So that's something to be aware of, and especially since those people may not be as familiar with the type of liabilities that we face, they may be more likely to engage those. Work comp is another thing that's a little bit different, especially with volunteers, because volunteers, they are covered under your workers' compensation policy, even though they're not paid. So there are some changes, some slight differences in how that's dealt with volunteers. Obviously, some of the unique exposures are less experience, youthful judgment if you're employing those young seasonal employees. Supervision requirements will change for various reasons as well when we bring on our seasonal hires. The child labor laws come into play. We're much more likely to have minors employed during the summer months than we are the rest of the year. And so that becomes an issue for us that's unique to these sets of employees and volunteers. And also there's some unique problems that can arise when we have employees who have been injured during the year and maybe are lost time and they're drawing a work comp benefit and the season ends. Lots of times we see these work comp claims, and at the end of the season, this claim stays open, and we look at it, and we try to figure out why we're not doing something with this employee, and we realize, oh, well, the season ended, so, they're gone. And so we'll talk also a little bit about a couple of little things to keep in mind if you do have one of your seasonal employees who's injured and off work, especially when you get to the end of the season. So supervision. What are some of the things we need to be thinking about when it comes to supervision? Now, the first thing that really comes to my mind is when we get into the summer months or whatever our seasonal period is, and we bring on our seasonal employees, generally what we do is we increase the number of employees that we have to supervise, but we probably don't increase the number of supervisors that we have. So all of a sudden you have supervisors that are tasked with, having to oversee more workers than they normally do. In addition to this increase in the worker to supervisor ratio, is we also have, this change in the workers, competencies as far as their ability to do the job, their ability to do the job safely. And so that seasonal employee or that volunteer who's coming in to do something for a short period of time may require a higher level of supervision also to help make sure that that employee is doing the job correctly and that they're doing it safely. So not only do we have this increased demand for the supervisor with more people to supervise, but we have a set of people in that group being supervised that actually need more attention than your regular employees may need. So that can be some real stresses, on providing adequate supervision. I was talking to a member recently who has the vast majority of all their work comp claims are with their seasonal employees over the years. And so one of the things they specifically did is they have identified a regular employee to act as a supervisor for these seasonal employees so that we're not stretching our regular supervisors out thinner. We do a seasonal promotion for someone, to be a supervisor to help spread out and lighten that load and make sure volunteers and seasonal employees get the adequate supervision that they need. So again, lack of experience is going to require more supervision and training. And also, if you have a lot of minors, working for you, then there's also, not the same judgment abilities going on, and those kids that are working for you may make some poor decisions. Also requiring that we make sure we have supervisors there engaged in what's going on with those employees. They're not going to be as likely to be able to self-supervise, as an adult, and especially as much as a regular employee would be. So think about that. How's your supervision set up to cover your seasonal employees? Is it adequate? Do we need to make some adjustments? And then also, talking to our supervisors that are going to be working with these seasonal employees, to be aware of some of the differences that they may have to dealing with young people, for example. You're probably going to supervise a 16-year-old different than you'd supervise a 45-year-old. And so, that's something that also would need to be addressed, is the style of supervision, when dealing with especially young employees. Another thing that I mentioned that is an option out there that we see more and more members using is going to a temp agency for their seasonal hires. Instead of going through the whole process of hiring individuals and processing all these applications and interviews and everything, going to a temp agency kind of gives you a one-stop shop. You can go in there, you can let them know what your needs are, what kind of skills and abilities you require, for specifically the work that you need to have done, and they will take care of, identifying and rounding up those employees for you. It takes a lot off your plate coming into the season, if you think about it, using that temp agency. So there's a huge convenience there, using that temp agency. However, there is an increased cost. You may be looking at anywhere from 12 to 50% more cost hiring that employee through a temp agency, depending on, their skills and abilities and their experience. But that cost is for a reason. Number one, that temp agency is covering the workers' compensation on that employee. So you bring in your seasonal employee that is, remember, anywhere from 3 to 12 times more likely to have an accident than your regular employees are. And that risk is transferred to the employment agency. If that employee gets injured working for you, the temp agency, is their workers' comp insurance is going to cover that, and your workers' comp isn't going to take that hit. So it protects your EMOD, from any effects, adverse effects from your increased risk of having injuries associated with the short-time employees. You do still have a similar liability exposure with your employees. That temp employee is still working for you and representing you if they have any interactions with the public or things like that. And so again, you're still going to want to make sure that there should be some training there. We still need to make sure that we want these that they're working safely. And so there is going to be some need for training on there. It doesn't totally transfer all the inconvenience associated with seasonal and temporary workers, but it does transfer a lot of that as well as a significant part of the risk to another entity. So we would encourage you to, if it makes sense for the operations that you need to have staffed, that's something to consider. You can talk to some temp agencies and see how well it may work for you. You may even talk to some other cities and districts or counties that use temp agencies and see how it works for them. And we may even be able to help you hook up with some people who are doing that, so you can, pick their brain and see how it works for them and if that might be a good option for you. Volunteers, that this is an option. Lots of times we do fill positions with volunteers. There's great people out in our community who have a ton of expertise and experience. They may be people that are later on in their careers or retired, and they want to participate in the community. They want to be of service. They want something to do. And so it's a great opportunity to take advantage of people who have great skills and abilities, and it's free. We don't have to pay for it because they're willing to volunteer their time. However, somebody that you're not paying may be a little bit more difficult to control. If I'm not drawing a paycheck and I decide not to come in today, because something happened, I may be more likely to, not come in or decide I'm going to go on vacation for a while or whatever. So there could be potential issues there, with having less ability to control somebody who isn't dependent on you for their livelihood. They do still represent your entity, especially if they are filling an official capacity. They are an official volunteer who has been approved, and so their actions will potentially expose you to liabilities depending on, what they're doing, whether they're driving, whether they're interacting with the public, whether they're doing things that could be, harassing or other things like that. So again, there's still the requirement and the need to make sure that your volunteers get a level of training, both for, human resource type issues as well as for their safety, because there is still those same exposures that you would have with employees exist with a volunteer. Also with volunteers, it's very important that we know who our volunteers are. So especially if you're filling a specific position, you're going to, be selecting a specific person that is going to be named or approved. As a general rule, we need the mayor or the head of your organization to approve the volunteers or to designate someone within the organization who is authorized to approve volunteers. Maybe if you're only using volunteers for a very short-term basis, maybe it's just for a day, or a week, we still need to keep a roster of who those people are that are volunteering for us, because guess what? If they get hurt, workers' compensation is going to cover the medical on that injury. And so we need to make sure we know who the people are that are that were exposed to with that hazard of covering them with our work comp insurance. If we have someone who comes out who wasn't approved, they weren't on a list, and they come out and they say, I was helping clean up the park on Saturday, and I stepped in a hole and broke my ankle, and I want you guys to pay to fix my ankle. That can happen. We really need to try and have some control so that we know who our approved volunteers are. However, having someone covered by workers' compensation is much preferable to having them covered on your liability insurance, because the workers' compensation for a volunteer is only going to cover the medical only, whereas on a liability, someone may come in, they may try and get special or punitive damages or something like that, and so we actually have more control over the costs on a work comp. So make sure that we're looking at our volunteer programs. Selecting volunteers is similar to hiring, especially if you're selecting someone to fill a specific position. So you're going to be looking for someone who has the experience and the skills and the abilities to do the job that you're looking to fill. We may need to go through a vetting process, background checks, motor vehicle records checks, and other things. if you're looking for an individual to volunteer for a specific position, you're going to want them to fill out an information sheet similar to an application form. Be very careful not to ask any information on this information sheet that you wouldn't have on an application form. In other words, any of those things that may trigger, protected class discrimination accusations, asking people about, their age or about, ethnicity, about familial status. A lot of these things, that we would be concerned about in the hiring process actually can apply here when we're selecting volunteers as well. We don't want to be discriminating against individuals in our volunteer selection process. You may still want to interview people and check their references. If you get to the point where you want to extend them this official volunteer position, you may at that point, think about doing background checks, criminal MVR checks, and especially if you're going to have people working with minors or with vulnerable individuals like the elderly, then you may want to make sure and check the sex offender registry as well when you're selecting those volunteers. If you find a volunteer, you want to offer them a specific position. If we were hiring someone, we'd extend them a job offer. With the volunteer, maybe we do a memorandum of understanding. We may want to spell out clearly what this volunteer's job duties are, what the expectations are for them filling that position. Make sure that they know that that city or district or county policies and procedures will apply to them in filling that position. And so we need to make sure that we identify, what information needs to be covered in orientation, as well as far as policy and procedures and other human resources issues, as well as safety training. Safety training becomes really important regardless of whether we're talking about a seasonal employee or a volunteer, because these positions, like we've said, are ones where people are more likely to have an injury. So when we're filling that volunteer position or we're filling our seasonal positions, we need to make sure that we've identified what the hazards are associated with the jobs that we're going to be asking this individual to do. So very important to be doing a job hazard analysis, knowing what the hazards are, identifying what safety training needs to be provided ahead of time, what kind of personal protective equipment needs to be identified for that employee or that volunteer to use while they're working. This is just as important, if not more important, for these individuals as it is for your regular employees. Again, harassment prevention training is a human resource topic that you're going to want to throw in there, especially when we're dealing with youth. Lots of people who are, 14, 15, 16, 17. We see a lot of these, summer employees that are 16, 17 years old. They may not have ever had a sexual harassment or harassment discrimination training before. And so they have a totally different understanding, of what's acceptable. They've got this really wild, idea of what's funny and the way they like to tease each other. And so we have to be really careful that we provide adequate instruction and training and supervision for those individuals to make sure that they're behaving appropriately while they are representing us. Again, proper supervision is extremely important here as well, because there's a higher need actually for supervision with these employees than there is for your regular employees that are more familiar with policies and procedures and their jobs and expectations. So let's talk specifically about child labor laws and how this breaks down. When we look at child labor laws, we're basically looking at two groups. The minimum age under Department of Labor standards and Fair Labor Standards Acts that we can employ children is basically 14 years of age. There are a few exceptions to that, a few very limited types of work that children younger than that can do. And of course, we're talking about non-agricultural jobs. There's a lot of exceptions and different rules for agricultural jobs, but we're looking at these 14 and 15-year-olds are in one group or category. And then we have 16 and 17-year-olds that fall into a different category. I'm just kind of wondering, anybody recognize who this young summer employee lifeguard is here? Jason, tell me if anybody shoots that one and if they recognize that individual there. A lot of these rules that we're dealing with minors in the working is hours. What hours can they work? What kind of breaks do they have to have? And is the work dangerous? What kind of restrictions are there on the dangerous work that employees can do? And 17-year-olds actually fall into another little subcategory because under certain conditions they can drive vehicles, which the 14, 15, and 16-year-olds cannot. So before I change slides, Jason, did anybody figure that one out?
I have two responses. One is Doug, and the other one is Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan is correct. That's Ronnie right there. So good job. One of the things we see lots of times with these rules, with these child labor law rules, and a lot of laws, is that we have state laws and that there's federal laws. And so, the Fair Labor Standard Act comes into play a lot in setting some rules for child labor laws. The Department of Labor, manages that. And so we see these federal rules, and then we also see state rules. And so whichever one has the more strict law, that's the one that applies. And I'll show you an example of that as we go through there, because there is a specific incidence where the Utah law doesn't quite line up with the federal law, which makes it almost kind of nullifies part of one law or the other, because we have to go with whatever is the more strict law between state and federal. So talking about Fair Labor Standard Acts for minors, specifically talking about, what are they paid, what hours can they work? Again, there's two basic categories. We're looking at 14, 15-year-olds, 16 and 17-year-olds as well. And in fact, when it comes to the pay, for minors, this actually goes up to age 20, according to the Department of Labor. A really good resource to look at that I used is if you go to the Department of Labor's website, there is a bulletin, Child Labor Bulletin 101, talks about a lot of this information, including pay and hours it can work and dangers and hazardous work. But for these minors, you can actually pay them $4.25 an hour while they're training. It's considered a training period. It's a 90 calendar day, not 90 work days, but it's 90 calendar days. You can pay that lower minimum wage to people under the age of 21. Once the first 90 calendar days are done, then you have to pay them the regular minimum wage of at least $7.25. So that's a little bit of a difference in pay potentially for minors. Another big difference that we need to consider is what hours minors can work. So specifically talking about 14 and 15-year-olds, and this is where most of the restrictions lies with this age group. You cannot employ a 14 or 15-year-old during school hours. You can't employ a 14 or 15-year-old to work before 7 o'clock in the morning or after 7 o'clock in the evening. There's an exception to that, however, though, between the 1st of June and Labor Day, that is extended to 9 o'clock. So 14 and 15-year-olds can work till 9 o'clock during the summer. This is where there's a difference between Utah law for child labor and federal law, because the Utah law actually says in the summer they can work till 9:30. But since the federal law says 9 o'clock, that's a more strict rule. We have to observe, in this case, the federal law, and minors can't work past 9 o'clock. At least the 14 and 15-year-olds can't work past 9 o'clock in the summertime. How many hours can they work? Well, if it's during school, if it's a school day, you can't work that 14 or 15-year-old more than 3 hours on a school day, and that includes Fridays. Even though the next day is not a school day, on that actual calendar Friday day, you can't work that student more than 3 hours if that is a school day. If it's a non-school day, so it's a Saturday, or if it's during the summer or during vacation when school isn't in session, that 14 or 15-year-old can work up to 8 hours, but not more than 8 hours. Also, if it's a school week, that 14 or 15-year-old can work up to 18 hours in the week. During the summer or during non-school weeks, then your 14 and 15-year-olds can work up to 40 hours, but not more than 40 hours. So there's no overtime allowed for 14 and 15-year-olds. And, it's with all of these rules that we're talking about with child labor law, if you have an area where you want to employ a minor and it's in a way that doesn't quite fit into these rules, whether it's on these school rules or doing dangerous work or different types of work that may be questionable how about dangerous it is, you can apply for a work permit. That is when you get a work permit. A lot of people will call some, they'll say, if I'm employing minors, do I have to get a work permit? Well, there's not really a work permit as long as we're staying within the guidelines of the child labor laws. But if what we're doing with this minor, if it pushes the limits of the child labor laws into, dangerous work or hours or whatever, then you can apply for a work permit that may give you permission. And of course, they'll want to be very specific about, what the exceptions are and how we're going to keep these students safe while they're working. And so that's something to be aware of. I don't really recommend pushing that. I don't think we should try and put any minors to work doing things that would require us to even have to go and apply for a work permit. So generally, we don't have to worry about work permits. There is some exceptions to these rules for the hours worked by minors. If they are 17, but they've already graduated from high school, okay, a lot of these rules aren't going to apply to them. If this is a student or a minor who is excused from compulsory attendance rules for whatever reason, they have an exemption or an exclusion from being required to attend school, then these rules may not apply to them. If it's a child that has to support a child, then there may be some exceptions made for that person as well. Or if you have someone who's been permanently kicked out of the educational system and the court hasn't ordered them to attend some other type of school, then a lot of these, hours, rules for hours worked wouldn't apply there potentially either. But with each of those exceptions, there are very specific details that apply and considerations that you would need to look at. And so it'd be a very good idea if you're looking at hiring a minor that you think one of these exceptions might apply to, then let's double check the laws. Let's make sure, give us a call, consult with your attorney, and make sure that we're doing everything we need to for these exceptions to make sure that they're actually valid for us. So the next group is the 16 and 17-year-olds, and they're treated a lot different when it comes to the hours worked. When we're talking about hours worked for 16, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, there's no limitation. We don't have that 3 hours on work days and no overtime and all that stuff. So 16 and 17-year-olds, we don't need to really worry about how many hours we're working. And there are fewer restrictions on the type of work that they can do as far as dangerous work. There's still a lot of restrictions, but there are fewer than, with the 14 and 15-year-olds. If there are other things that come into play with child labor laws or are breaks, rest breaks and meal breaks. The labor laws don't really identify required meal breaks and rest breaks for adults. Okay, there's no mandatory law that said you must have so much time for a lunch break. I know I've worked at a lot of companies that it's company policy that you get rest breaks and meal breaks within certain time periods. But the law is specific for minors. So when we're talking about child labor, we must provide them with a 30-minute meal break at or before 5 hours of work. Okay, so that is mandatory. You have to make sure that they get a half-hour lunch break. It can be paid or unpaid, but you have to make sure that they get that half-hour lunch break. Also, minors must be provided with a 10-minute rest break for each 3-hour period that they work. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind as you're scheduling those employees. It's not just a convenience for them to stop and eat, sometime during the day. You specifically have to make sure they get that lunch break at or before 5 hours and that they have at least one 10-minute break within every 3-hour work period that they have. So another consideration there that you need to be aware of. So let's talk about what we can have minors doing. What are dangerous occupations that are precluded or that minors aren't allowed to do or that we're not allowed to employ minors to do? Mining is one of them. That always messes me up when I say minors and mining. But manufacturing processes, mining, of course, there's different categories for different types of mining, but it doesn't really matter because all types of mining apply, and we can't employ minors to do mining. Any kind of processing, so meat processing, assembly, all sorts of different types of processing things that we can't do with 14 and 15-year-olds. Now, again, this is the 14 and 15-year-olds we're talking about here. Also, they leave a kind of a smorgasbord here for the Secretary of Labor. Any job identified by the Secretary of Labor as being hazardous, then you can't have 14 and 15-year-olds doing that. So they kind of leave that caveat in there so they can basically identify anything, that they say that 14 and 15-year-olds can't do. 14 and 15-year-olds cannot work with hoisting apparatus. That has anything to do with oiling, maintaining, or using hoisting apparatus. Working in boiler rooms or engine rooms, again, anything to do with oiling, maintaining, repairing, or working in, a boiler room is something that we can't have 14 and 15-year-olds doing. And I know a lot of you out there do have pressure vessels and boilers in some of your facilities, so that's something to remember. You can't have your 14 and 15-year-olds going around those pressure vessels. Maintenance or repair of machinery and equipment in general. So a 14, 15-year-old cannot be your mechanic. We don't use them for maintenance and repair of equipment. Also, operation of motor vehicles. Ta-da, 14, 15-year-olds should not be driving, especially not for work, and they can't work on a vehicle as a driver's helper. Also, you can't have them riding on the outside of a vehicle. Now, I would like to say that should be a rule for all employees. We've had some really terrible injuries happen from employees riding in the backs of trucks or on trailers that are moving. And so that's just a pretty good rule for everybody, but specifically 14 and 15-year-olds cannot ride on the outside of a vehicle. It's not to say that they can't be in a vehicle, but they can't be working on a vehicle, as driving around doing deliveries, and being a driver's helper kind of a thing. Window washer, if it's on the outside of the building, working at an elevation, so out working on windowsills or up on a ladder or something like that, 14 and 15-year-olds cannot do that either. Any power-driven machine a 14 or 15-year-old cannot use, and that includes lawnmowers, that includes golf carts, ATVs, trimmers, cutters, weed eaters, edgers. So a lot of these things may even be things that kids use at home. I got my 14-year-old cut the grass and used a weed eater and everything. It's something they're familiar with, but specifically for child labor laws, if you're under 16, you cannot operate even those lawn care equipment, okay? They have to be 16 years old. Additionally, ladders and scaffolding. 14 and 15-year-olds, you can't have them doing any work that requires them to get up in an elevated area. They can't work on ladders. They can't work on scaffolding. They can't work on any substitutes of scaffolding, i.e. stacked up boxes, standing on chairs. I don't know, whatever is your substitute for ladders and scaffolding, okay? You can't have 14 and 15-year-olds working at heights is basically, I think, what they're saying. Baking and cooking is another one, especially where we're dealing with commercial equipment, powered, mixers and deep fat fryers and things like that can be very dangerous. So a lot of baking and cooking restrictions for 14 and 15-year-olds. Working in freezers or coolers, they may be allowed to go in just incidentally to get something out of a freezer or cooler, but they can't have a job that requires them to be actually working where their job is inside the freezer or cooler. Youth peddling is a big, category where they list all sorts of things that have to do with, loading sales kits, loading and unloading vehicles and doing sales routes that we can't do with 14 and 15-year-olds. Unloading and loading vehicles, catching, Jason will love this one, catching and cooping of poultry. Okay, so 14 and 15-year-olds, and it specifically lists this, catching and cooping of poultry you cannot do with 14 and 15-year-olds.
I did that.
I'm sure you did, that's what I said. So,
Doug, we have a question on can a 14, 15-year-old operate a pitching machine?
Is it powered? So, I mean,
yeah.
Again, they're very strict on the 14 and 15-year-olds. From what I've seen, of course, they don't list every type of equipment specifically, but they do list, when they list the powered, I'm not finding where I listed here, but when they talk about powered equipment, they say in caps, all powered equipment, you know, cannot be operated by 14 and 15-year-olds. So public messenger service, warehousing, communications, public utilities, construction, a lot of stuff that goes into that. So that's 14 and 15-year-olds. Pretty, you know, restrictive of what you can do with 14 and 15-year-olds. There is a whole section in that DOL bulletin on child labor number 101 that does give you specifics about what they can do if you want to look that up and read it. But yeah, definitely any powered equipment. They do emphasize all powered equipment is excluded from the work that 14 and 15-year-olds can do. So let's talk about 16 and 17-year-olds. I think we employ more 16 and 17-year-olds for our summer work than we do the 14 and 15-year-olds. So here's restrictions we're looking at with them. Nothing to do with explosives, okay? No transporting, handling, you know, working in or around areas where explosives are being used. Again, mining is not permitted for 16 and 17-year-olds. There's a lot of different types of forestry work, including fighting forest fires, doing fire prevention in forests, and other types of forestry work that is precluded for 16 and 17-year-olds. Powered woodworking equipment. Now, so with the 16 and 17-year-olds, they don't say that you can't use powered tools, but they do list specific powered tools that they can't use. So powered woodworking tools, you know, so a wood lathe, you know, or, you know, other things like that, you know, would be something that a 16 or 17-year-old can't use. A powered hoisting equipment like a crane or a forklift, we can't have 16 or 17-year-olds operating. Powered metal forming equipment, powered bakery equipment, you know, like a big mixer, dough presses or things like that. Powered balers or compactors. You can't work, 16, 17-year-olds can't work in brick or tile manufacturing. And, you know, that may even have something to do with what Jason's going to talk about one of these days here with the silica stuff. But circular saws, chainsaws, band saws are specifically mentioned as tools that 16 and 17-year-olds cannot use. Guillotine shears, wood chippers, abrasive cutting discs, wrecking, demolition, shipbreaking, roofing. Kind of hard to do roofing without getting on a ladder or scaffolding anyway, but roofing and excavation work. You can't have 16 or 17-year-olds working in trenches or other excavations like that. So that's, you know, not quite as restrictive as on the 14 and 15-year-olds. They do, for the 16 and 17-year-olds, have hazardous occupation categories that go into a lot of depth of actually identifying what each of those categories includes. So if you need to get in more in depth on any of those exclusions that we just talked about with 16 and 17-year-olds, there are some rather in-depth definitions of each of those categories. So one thing that 17-year-olds can do is they can drive vehicles. So 16-year-olds cannot drive a car or a truck as part of their work, but a 17-year-old can with certain conditions which all have to be met. Number one, they have to be 17 years old. They have to be licensed for the vehicle that they are operating. They have to have attended and passed a state-approved driver's education program. They have to have no moving violations on their MVR at the time that they're hired. They specifically say at time of employment, there cannot be any moving violations on their driver's license. They cannot operate a vehicle that's larger than 6,000 pounds. So, you know, regular passenger cars or light pickup trucks, you know, they may be able to operate, but over 6,000 pounds, they cannot. The vehicles that they do operate must have seat belts for the driver and passengers. Okay, and they must receive instruction in and have mandatory rules for seatbelt use. So, you know, we want to do that for everybody anyway. We want to require everybody wear their seatbelts, but specifically if you've got the 17-year-old driving, they're very specific that those seatbelts must be used. That instruction must be given. Also, the driving that the 17-year-old can do is incidental. They can't have their primary function of their job being to drive around in a car or a truck. So the way you look at that is the maximum amount of time that 17-year-old can spend driving is a third of a workday. So that would be the max amount that they could do in any given day, would be a third of their shift. But the week, they're limited to just a fifth or 20% of their work week. So obviously, if they went up to 33% on a day, that means on another day, they're going to have to drive a lot less. So in a work week, no more than 20% of their time can be spent driving. They cannot tow anything. So specifically, so if you've got them out there and they've got the public works truck and they're towing the trailer, you know, from the yard out to the park, you know, with the lawnmowers and everything on it, they're very specific in here about no towing anything. Only autos and trucks, you know, 6,000 pounds or less. No motorcycles, no all-terrain vehicles. And this may be a bomb for some people, but 16 and 17-year-olds cannot drive golf carts. I know that was specifically listed on the 14 and 15-year-olds too, but in this DOL bulletin number 101 for child labor, it very specifically states in there no golf carts, even for these 17-year-olds. And maybe one of the reasons is because that golf cart probably doesn't have seat belts, but don't hold me to that. If you retrofit your golf cart with seat belts, I can't guarantee that that would become acceptable, because they are very specific in that bulletin about no golf carts. They cannot drive a regular delivery route. They cannot drive a sales route. They can't transport for hire, so they can't be driving a truck where the business is being paid to move freight or the business is to be paid to move people. There's no time-sensitive delivery. So if you've got something that has to be someplace by a certain time, you cannot have the 17-year-old drive it, because we don't want them feeling rushed into, you know, driving faster than safe, specifically for that young driver. That 17-year-old, if they do have passengers, they can transport other employees, for example, but they cannot have more than 3 passengers in that vehicle with them. The maximum radius from their place of employment that they can travel is 30 miles, and the maximum number of trips that they can make per day is 2 trips, depending on the type of trip that it is. So if it's a delivery where they're delivering things someplace, no more than 2 trips in a day. So the 17-year-olds can operate a car or a truck, but with some, you know, some significant restrictions there. Seasonal employees, some other things that we just want to throw in right here at the end to be aware of is that if you do have that employee get injured while they're doing their seasonal employment and they are off work because of the injury, we want to be really careful when it comes to the end of the season of just terminating their employment because they were seasonal employees and the season was over. What can happen with us often is we have that seasonal employee, you know, they don't have work restrictions, we haven't got them back to work, the season ends, and then we terminate them. Well, what happens to their work comp benefit? It continues. Just because we terminated them doesn't mean that work comp benefit turns off. And so we're going to have any medical, of course, is going to be treated regardless. But if they're getting payment, you know, they're 66 2/3% of their regular pay, if they're getting that work comp benefit, that will continue. And so once you've terminated them, you can't bring them back to work because they're terminated and then they keep getting paid. So let's say this is a college student. You know, we terminate them at the end of the season, and they were drawing a work comp benefit at the time, and they keep drawing that work comp benefit. They go to school, they get paid the whole time they're at school, courtesy of you, because, you know, we can't bring them back to work. In order to turn that clock off on that benefit, you know, we have to be able to close the claim. You know, so and that makes it very difficult when we've terminated them because we have no control, no power over them once we've done that. So if they are off work at the end of the season, don't terminate them. When restrictions are provided, when the doctor comes through and says, hey, this employee can now work with lifting restrictions or whatever it may be, then you get a hold of that person and you offer them a position with accommodating their restrictions. And works especially well with students. So if they're back at school, or especially if they've left town and gone to college, they're not going to come back to work. Hey, I'm at school, I can't come back to work. Well, once they refuse to return to work when you've offered them that position, then we can go ahead and close the books on that claim. So just be real careful about that. If you do have any of your seasonal part-time employees, you know, that are on a work comp benefit at the time that we terminate that seasonal employment. Don't just blanket terminate everybody, because, it'll make it really difficult to close that work comp claim, and they can wind up drawing that for a long time past when, we would be able to close that claim otherwise. If you have any questions about that, if you're in a situation like that, give us a call. We can take a look at it with you and make sure that, we're doing that right in a way to make sure we're controlling that claim as best possible. So in summary, remember there are higher risks, associated with the employment of short-timers, temporary seasonal employees. They're much more likely to get injured. We need to really pay a lot of attention to their safety training, to their safety induction, to making sure that they have and use appropriate equipment, and that they're being supervised appropriately, because they are much more likely to get hurt. Also, your selection and hiring process is something to remember and consider. Remember that volunteer, is pretty much an employee that you're not paying. So a lot of your processes that you go through in selecting a volunteer, are going to be very similar to what you do in a hiring process. So keep that in mind as well. Again, supervision, very important, to make sure you're not stretching your current supervisor's load so thin with your part-time and your summer hires that they can't adequately supervise people who especially probably need a little extra supervision. Make sure you're identifying your orientation and training needs, both what type of safety training is necessary, what kind of instruction on personal protective equipment is necessary, and other things like harassment and discrimination training and things like that may be foreign to some of these young workers. These child labor laws are something you really need to be aware of, especially when employing people under the age of 20 and especially between the ages of 14 to 17. We want to make sure that we aren't putting those kids to work doing things that are safe, that are unsafe. We do want them to be safe, and we need to make sure that we're clear on what is allowed and not allowed, for those workers. Again, if you've got an employee off work on a work comp at the end of the season, give us a call. Make sure we're not just automatically terminating them because the season's over, because we may be able to get that claim closed up a lot easier if you don't terminate them right away. So, any questions, Jason?
Yeah, Doug, we've got a couple of questions that have come in, specific questions about tasks. The two different tasks they bring up is tree trimming and operating riding lawnmowers. And the question is, are seasonals able to operate riding lawnmowers? Now, you may want to differentiate between youth and
yeah, a seasonal employee may be an adult, or they may be an older youth. So like you hire college kids in the summertime, college people, I guess I shouldn't call them kids, in the summertime. They may be 18. Once you're 18 years old, those restrictions on hazardous duty don't apply to anybody. It's only under 18 where those restrictions apply. So seasonal employees, there's no restriction as far as hazardous work that they can do. Again, we want to make sure we're properly training them and identifying hazards and dealing with those hazards. Tree trimming, that's going to be something you would have to be really careful with, because number one, if we're talking about chainsaws, that is one of those things that a 16, 17-year-old cannot use. And so that's a specific restriction that would be a very common tool used in tree trimming. If we're using just a pruning hook, an extended, pruning saw, that's not listed in here. So, that may be okay. But then if they have to get up on a ladder, or get up in that tree, that may be an issue with them getting up off the ground. And so, trimming trees could be difficult for someone under 18 to be able to trim trees for you, because there's going to be limitations as far as working off the ground and using a chainsaw and things like that.
All right, let's see. I think that looks like all the questions that we have, which really kind of surprises me.
The phone calls will come in later.
Yeah, no, I think you've covered it really well. Okay, anything to add?
No, that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a call. You can reach any one of us, here at the main number for the office, 801-936-6400. or we have a toll-free number, 800-748-4440. You can just, type in our name, get our name, and that'll transfer you to us wherever we are. There's my cell number. If you're one of my members, feel free to give me a call on that anytime. Our email addresses are our first name at utahtrust.gov, so Jason at, Brent at, and Doug at utahtrust.gov. So if you have any questions about any of this stuff, go ahead and shoot those off to us, and we'll be glad to talk to you about your specifics.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. All right, guys. Thank you very much for attending. If you've got questions, give us a call. Aside from that, have an awesome day.